The red flag flying here.
On Socialist Think Tank tonight, and we are talking to Julie, Helen and Owen from the Say No to Hassockfield campaign. What we're going to do is we're going to get a little bit of background on the campaign, what's planned, you know, what happens with what the Home Affairs Office thinks about things, and we've also taken live comments in the chat, so if anyone wants to chat to us, I've got the live comments box up here and they'll come up on your screen in real time. So I'd like to ask Owain, so could you give us a little bit of a background and where you are now and what your plans are for the future for the campaign?
I'll try and be brief because it's quite a lot, but so the campaign started formally at the end of January, when a lot of things happened. So Richard Holden, obviously the unfortunate Tory MP for North West Durham, posted on his Facebook page saying that there's going to be this brand new centre, lots of jobs, all this kind of stuff coming forward at the Hassockfield site, bringing with it all of the connotations that have gone previously. So as everyone knows, Medham Detention Centre was there previously, and when it closed late 80s, early 90s, it was left empty until the early 2000s when it was turned into a secure training centre with brand new buildings, in effect a prison for majority of them were juveniles really, and then that opened and then finally closed in 2015 and then was left empty. In January, all of a sudden, out of the blue, it turned out that the Home Office wanted to turn it into an immigration detention centre at the time. It wasn't a removal centre, although they're technically the same kind of thing, but I'll come to that distinction a bit later on. So some Labour Party candidates in North West Durham had a briefing with Carl Marshall, who was then the cabinet member concerned. So I'm next to a window, so if you hear any noise, that's from outside, it's not in the room. Where there were lots of things said. It turned out the Section 106 notice that was meant to come forward from Homes England for the site, because it was meant to be knocked down and turned into housing with lots and lots of community sums. I think it would have been initially about £1.5 million of investment within Meadowsley Edge and then a bit wider. And I think a quarter of a decade plan for things like the environment and looking after and stewardship basically for the area. So new doctor surgeries, new teaching allocations, obviously new teachers, new housing. So that was all quite exciting in lots of ways. And then the Home Office came in and said, well, actually, Ministry of Justice still own the site, so they can use it for whatever they want, basically. Because they hadn't hadn't received notification from the Home Office that they hadn't got rid of it and that kind of stuff. So they basically took it back into the estate. And so, yes, we kind of met for the first time. And by we, I mean myself, Julie, Bill McKeith from what is now Oxford Against Detention, but was the anti-Council campaign, which Helen will touch on a bit later on. And Suzanne Fletcher from Tees Valley Sanctuary at the very beginning of February, and then it's kind of exploded from there. So we've grown every week since then. In terms of the site, there's been lots of things being said publicly that don't quite match up to what is the truth. And we were approached by the legal team from the Yards Wood campaign to give us a bit of a hand. And they put in an FOI on three things. And it turns out that everything that was said in terms of the site, like I say, wasn't true. So it was decided in October 2020 that the site would be used to house, in inverted commas, migrants. And then the following month, so November, it would be specifically for women. And then Homes England was kind of pushed to one side and the site given back to the MOJ. The slight problem being that in January, given the briefings and the conversations that DCC had with the Home Office, there were no guarantees on three things. Firstly, that it would be single sex. Secondly, that it wouldn't house children. And third, that if it was going to be mixed sex, that it would be segregated properly. And there are two distinct areas within the site where that could be feasible. The problem for people like us is that if, for example, you're a woman who's been trafficked plucked somewhere out of the blue from Syria, there's a very high likelihood that you'll be faced with your own trafficker because the estate currently is being closed, or the immigration estate is variously being closed down. Obviously, Napier is slightly different with what's going on today. But so the government policy, so certainly the law that hasn't changed since 2016, is firstly to reduce the asylum estate and / immigration estate, to reduce the numbers of people in the estate, and thirdly, to have it done, people looked after within the community. So prime example of that is there was a task force set up 2 years ago to look at community housing for people in the asylum system and in the immigration system, and of all places, the Castle upon Tyne. So that was meant to have, I think, approximately 200 people a year to go through it. So they'll be in the community, looked after by people who wanted them to be there, as their friends, as their neighbours, and potentially working as volunteers in cafes. So a good example is in Glasgow. So there's a place there that is specifically for women who have either been through the migration system or have been trafficked, are then given a volunteer job in a cafe. So a similar kind of idea, basically, in council. So that was meant to have, like I say, nearly 400 people go through it by the end of last month. And that's been very quietly closed down and only had 20 people in it over the last 18 to 24 months. So not only is the government policy to reduce the estate, but they're going against what they promised. And every time we've pushed a bit, and I mean on very simple things. So the Ministry of Justice put up two very large signs at the entrance to the prison, which Owen Temple, who's on our core group, noticed were a bit bigger than the average or normal sign to say what was going on. So I reported it to DCC, and they went through the process, and it turned out it was basically far too big to anything but an advertisement, and they had to be taken down by the Ministry of Justice. So when we did that, Richard Holden came out and said, oh, the number of jobs is increasing. We're going to have lots and lots of millions of pounds worth of investment in the area for all these secure jobs. And we all know full well they aren't secure. And he promised also on his, I think, in March, he would advertise jobs at the site on his own MP's Facebook page, and that hasn't happened. So since the end of March, or sorry, middle of March, they've advertised for a centre manager, and the initial advert actually said there are no requirements for qualifications at all. So you could come in from anywhere. You could come in from the prison system. You could come in from the education sector and just be plonked in and paid a massive wage for not doing very much, basically, not understanding what's going on, the issues involved. And there was no requirement for understanding the mental impact that detention has on women specifically either. And that went out on, I think, a group that sort of linked with us on their social media, and then that was deleted. So it looks like a normal thing that's going on. And then very quietly, even more quietly than Holden's usual quiet trick, Mighty were given the contract for the site, which is a slight issue on two fronts for me, in that they firstly have the contract for short-term asylum and immigration housing in Northern Ireland at Lord House. And secondly, their non-exec director, Baroness Cootie, sits in the House of Lords on the Tory benches. So, of course, there's no potential corruption there at all. And then there's another sort of slight tangential issue, really. If you look at the local politics that's going on, obviously with the change in the governing, coalition of chaos, as it were, on DCC that's come in, one of the current or new cabinet members, in fact, the one for equalities, ironically enough, Councillor Shield is a sitting councillor for Majesty and Ledgate Division, and there hasn't been a single equalities impact assessment done for the change from holding men and boys to holding women putatively. And a couple of people who've been involved with us have pushed on that with Holden's office. And also, I was a bit facetious at one point before he blocked me. Obviously, he blocks anyone who asks a basic question. So I actually asked on his initial post, do you know if the T's and C's for the workers at the site will be better or worse, because it will be privately run, than in the public sector? And he replied saying, oh, I've got no idea. And so anyway, that's the one side. And then, so that now we went on, myself, Julie and Owen Temple were actually interviewed at the site about what's been going on. And what we're not saying is, which is what Holden is saying we are, is that we're not anti-detention in the sense that if somebody has been convicted, whether they're a migrant, asylum seeker, or whatever, of a crime that they've committed in the UK, they are dealt with by the prison system, not the immigration system. And that is what Holden is basically saying is going to happen. They'll be all criminals, they'll all be overstayers of visa and that kind of stuff, and they won't. I mean, basic point is, it just won't. People will be dumped there. And Napier Barracks is a very good example. I mean, obviously it's a slightly different thing because it's all men, but they just dump people there and they'll be there indefinitely. We're the only country in the Council of Europe to not have a time limit on detention, whether that be asylum or immigration. So
I was going to ask, because, sorry to interrupt, someone had put in the chat earlier saying, is this like meant to be a temporary measure, or is this going to be place them indefinitely? But you've just answered that. I can't believe that. That's terrible.
Well, weirdly enough, when it all came forward, it started off being a detention centre. So it would have been an IDC rather than an IRC. But that then very quietly changed to an immigration removal centre, which brings with it slightly different connotations in terms of what should and shouldn't be done there. But what will happen is that people will be taken from the streets without warning. I mean, I've got an example that when I worked for Julie, we saved somebody who was taken off the streets in Bury and removed down to Morton Hall, which is now going to close down, but then stay open and all this kind of stuff, without warning, by Home Office employed people. So unlike with the actual estate, they employ people directly to bring people off the streets and then dump them in these places. And it will be indefinite. And because a majority of people, I mean, I think over 50% of people who successfully challenge their detention, whether they're men or women or children, and go to a judicial review, have their claim agreed to by the judge in front of them. And no matter what Richard Holden says about, activist lawyers doing all this rubbish and pushing against the Home Office and having a secure board and that kind of stuff, no matter what happens in a case, they get paid. They're not activists. They're there to apply the pure simple of human rights within the current law. So with the removal centre, you've got a slight, obviously with Mighty coming in too, and also the regional politics with Ben Houchen buying Teesside airports. And this is a personal opinion, not necessarily one of our group, but my real worry is that if on the 30th of June, when you've got European citizens who haven't applied for settled status and haven't had it approved, they can be removed from anywhere within GB and NI to any part of the detention estate, and then removed from the UK. And to me, it would appear that Teesside airport could be that airport to wherever, because we have no agreements with, apart from one, I think it's cropped up today, where they can remove people to anywhere, or from Europe to anywhere within the European Union or elsewhere. So in terms of the campaign, like I say, we're working with Duncan Lewis, so the legal team. I can't really go into details at the minute because things are still a bit fluid. So that's on one side. We're working with loads of different groups, whether that be national charities. So Women for Refugee Women have been really involved with what we're doing. Avid Detention, who got us involved with the APPG on migration, and they put in what they've been doing with us. All really local charities like Mental Health North East, West End Refugee Service, North East Against Racism, and all sorts of other people besides. And we've had a couple of people pick up in the EU more broadly on what we're doing as well. And I think because we've kind of got to this point where we're doing things like this now, we've actually got a much broader reach of people who we can get involved and that kind of thing. So we've just had a public Facebook page set up, which has been great because it's been much more about sharing rather than it being ensuring that we have the same message given to everybody within the private group. We've got the website going, and it's suddenly become much more community based rather than it just being you're given something by us as a group and that kind of stuff. And that's fantastic. So a bit of a whistle stop story of what's been going on, but it's that there's tons I could add in, but I won't at the minute because it's quite complicated. So
I think it's so important. It's so important that you've got this campaign going. And we've had a couple of questions in the chat. So we've had one that says, do you think prison overcrowding has contributed to this? So I think they're talking about has contributed to people being like lifted off the streets and dropped in and things like that. No, Helen, you can come in if you want.
I was going to say, not at all. I think that we've got to separate out what's happening here. So there are an extremely small number of asylum seekers and refugees, because remember, we have some of the smallest number of refugees and asylum seekers in the world. People think that we have huge numbers and we do not. So the people that should be detained, as Owain mentioned, who have committed crimes, are a tiny, tiny proportion of the number of asylum seekers and refugees we have here, and they should be in prison. These detention centres are all about people who have entered this country, so-called now illegally because of the changes that have been made by this government, but many of whom have sought asylum and refugee status because they have been tortured, they've been subject to violence in their own countries, war, they come from countries where homosexuality is illegal, but they haven't been able to secure their refugee status and they are locked up in immigration detention centres. So it is a very separate subject in my head from people who have committed crimes that need to be in prison. Yep. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. And then we've had, sorry, go on, Julie.
Add though, the government will want to conflate this, okay? So it's in the government's interests, because what they want to do is to be seen to be tough on law and order and tough on border control. And they are purposefully confusing and conflating things, because a lot of people, in order to understand about immigration law and also about human rights laws and international norms on human rights, generally you have to do a bit of reading and a bit of research. So the government are hoping that people don't have the time and the energy and even the will to do that. And it's in their interest to keep people confused and to conflate the issue.
Yeah, I totally get that. They do that quite a lot, don't they? Like they do use misconceptions, and it is like old school trickery. Like, watch this way while I do this over here. It's mind-boggling. So we've had another question. Anthony asks, I'll not read all of it, I'll paraphrase. Are the people in these camps, military or not, detained or the whole time, or can they go and like go to the cinema? Can they go and do their own shopping? Like, can they do anything like that? Or are they literally in the detention centre for the whole time that they're there?
It's a type 3 prison. It's a category 3 prison. Let's call it what it is, okay?
Mm-hmm.
These people will be locked up. And if past history and experiences are anything to go by, they won't have access to a whole load of resources which they should have access to. Will suffer all kinds of emotional and psychological problems as a result.
Yeah.
Could I just give a little bit of political context? Is that okay?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I'm Julie Ward, and I was a Labour MEP for the northwest of England. I happen to live in County Durham, and I was on the Women's Rights and Gender Equality Committee in the European Parliament, and we actually did a report on the specific vulnerabilities of women refugees. So my committee did extensive research into how we need to take particular care of women refugees because of their vulnerabilities. And as part of that, I was involved in a delegation that went to look at best practice in terms of welcoming refugees, women refugees in Germany. And I use that word welcome because that's exactly what was happening. It wasn't arriving in this country and, clap you in irons and lock you up and call you a criminal. It was actually a welcome. And there was so I went to Munich, and there was a centre there. It had been, I think it had been some kind of military establishment, but it was like housing. So it was kind of all the housing, and they made this incredible place with a school, with medical facilities, with open spaces, with parks. The women and families could get on trams and buses and go into the town. And they also created social housing on this site for people who were homeless and who couldn't afford rent. So they were doing some really good things socially for the existing problems. What we've got in this country is basically a hostile environment that started under Theresa May, mm-hmm. and which has been ramped up increasingly by successive governments, and whipped up in the press so that it's stoked racism effectively in the country. And so what Richard Holden says, so anybody who wants this detention centre, this prison, what they talk about is, oh, that's what people voted for. They voted to have strong borders. They voted to kick out the illegals. And this is the language that they use. And it really plays into this rather horrendous racist agenda, which has been happening in our country ever since Theresa May sent those awful vans around telling people to go home. Yeah. I just want to also say how wonderful it is to hear the news today about Napier Barracks. Okay, Priti Patel has broken the law again, right? She is a lawbreaker, and she is the Home Office Minister, right? And she's a lawbreaker. And what she wants to do is to change the laws so that she can carry on breaking international law. And one of the things that I'm really, really concerned about is our place in the world. We do have a history of welcoming refugees. I am descended from Huguenot refugees, which is the first wave, large wave of refugees that came to this country in the late 1700s, a group of French refugees who were persecuted for their religious beliefs. And my ancestors ended up in Nottingham, and they had lace making skills, and they contributed to the economy and the wealth of that city. And if you know Nottingham, you will know that there is a lace market there. Mm-hmm. So our country has historically been a country that has welcomed refugees. And in fact, we all have in our history, our family histories, our histories of migration. The miners who, the great mining history of County Durham is also a story of migration. And what we've got to do is to start talking about the reality of why people move, because people do not leave their homes, their countries, their family, their status, their work for, they don't do that easily. It's a very difficult decision. Now, Owain mentioned that we've been working with refugee women, and Agnes Toner, who is a figurehead of that organisation now, was in Yarlswood. Agnes worked for an MP in her home country in the Ivory Coast. And the refugees who come to this country span the whole breadth of socio-economic background. We have professionals who are doctors, teachers, academics, business leaders, people that we need in this country to help us get back up on our feet again, the kind of people that my ancestors were, who brought those incredible skills to this country. And I think it's really important that we stop talking about people as illegals and criminals and start talking about them as people who are seeking asylum because they are fleeing violence and unsustainable lives. And I want to put unsustainable lives in there because climate refugees is also a massive issue now. We haven't got a grip on that at all, I have to say. And we don't, in fact, have a refugee crisis in Europe. We never have had a refugee crisis in Europe. We've had a crisis of solidarity. And yet we've seen some countries do so much more than other countries. And Helen pointed out, we take a very, very small proportion of refugees here. And so the government agreed to take some Syrian refugees, not very many, and it was pushed by people like Alf Dubs to take unaccompanied minors. And it had to be dragged, kicking and screaming in order to agree that, put a cap on it, and then decided just to get rid of the programme. So we do not play our part as an international partner in the resettlement, in the welcoming and the resettlement of vulnerable people. Women face violence on every stage of their journey. They are leaving because of violence. They are then subject to violence on their dangerous journeys. They may experience that many of them are fleeing sexual violence, and they experience even more sexual violence on the journey. And then they arrive in their destinations and they're subject to trafficking. Awful things happen at many of the borders. And then they arrive in this country and then they're treated like common criminals, when actually what they need is for us to hold out the hand and to be the sanctuary that we really, really should be. And whilst we're not in the EU anymore, we are still in the Council of Europe. And we are the only country in the Council of Europe, and that Council of Europe includes Turkey and Belarus, I might mention, okay, who are not doing very well on a whole load of other human rights issues, but we're the only country in the Council of Europe that uses indefinite detention. And I found a human rights committee report that the Council of Europe had written in 2018 on alternatives to detention. And there are pages of suggestions of different ways of dealing with people while they wait for due process through the courts. And those alternatives would allow people to lead much better lives with families. I'll share the link for the report for those who want to look at it. But the report also talks about the cost of detention as well. And we have the most expensive detention system in the Council of Europe because we lock people up and it costs the taxpayer loads of money. So this is not even, good in conservative politics to be spending so much money when we are at the end of a pandemic facing, Brexit-induced economic fallout with the double whammy of the pandemic. So I think we have to attack the Tories on their own issues by coming at them with the evidence that we've been looking at in our campaign group.
That's brilliant. And we've got everybody in total agreement with you in all of the comments. And I think personally, it's a massive oxymoron, isn't it, really? Like the Tories not bothered about their money. It seems pretty hard to believe. So we've had a question from Kat.
Say something else.
Yeah, of course.
These contracts will be given to mates, to friends.
Of course they will. Cronyism.
Owain has already pointed that out. That's where these contracts are going.
When will it? And I do understand. When will it stop? And I do feel like the campaign should just be the start of it. And I think if everybody hears about it more and catches the truth and isn't taken in by all of the shake-up of the lies and things, I do hope that more people help and do step up and say that it's not right. So we've had a question from Kat, and she says, do you think we can make that part of our personal collective submissions to the government's Women Health Strategy consultation? I'll read that again.
I think you're talking about the new plan for immigration, and there was a consultation on that, and all the members of our core team, we did extensive, detailed submissions. I think mine was about 7,500 words long. Fiona Ranson, who works with us, who's an expert in immigration and asylum matters, did the research for us. She read the whole document and pulled it apart. And it's a very divisive document. It does this deliberate conflation and mixing up of different terms. It uses and misuses statistics and asked yes/no questions or multiple choice questions, which were a trap to get people to agree with what the government want to do. I think we've got to keep up the pressure, actually, and even though that consultation has closed, there will be other opportunities for people to make their distaste known.
Yeah. Jen asks, how much time is there left before the government wants it to open?
It keeps on changing, and it keeps on changing based on how much pressure is applied and where. So it was meant to open originally in April. That was then pushed back to the summer, and then pushed back to the late autumn, and then kind of changed again into August, but it's now back into October. And there's one thing I forgot to mention on the category C style imprisonment, which I think will probably bring in a bit of Helen's experience at Council. But the one thing that really did shock me about the briefing that we had was not just the segregation of people if it is going to be mixed sex, but all of the people at the site will be refused, under the Home Office guidance, visitation rights. And that's not just people going in like befriend us at Yarl's Wood or Campsfield. It includes legal visits. So when you think, when you went to Morton Hall, I noticed the category C question a bit earlier on. It affected me horribly, and still does. And you're taken from a house at the front of Morton Hall, covered in bars and all sorts. So no window had proper natural light coming in because it was all kind of filtered through bars. And then you were taken through the proper front gate and had to go through 4 separate and distinct locked doors that were open for you and then locked behind you. You're made to leave your belongings, including your watch and your rings, in a locker, and then taken through another couple of doors that were locked and whatever, and then dropped into a interview room next to a room that, ironically enough, had furnishings that were basically the colours of UKIP, so purple and gold. And then the warders, which they are basically warders, but paid privately rather than from the public sector, went to get the person that we were meeting, and you could hear them going down the corridor to this person's room, locking all of the gates behind them, and then opening the door and bringing him in. And the thing that really sticks with me is how mentally destroyed this person was. So they'd gone from being really involved with their community. They had a great family. They were just about to, as it turned out, their partner was pregnant, but it's about to start their own family properly. They're involved with their mosque. They're involved with all the different community groups, that kind of thing. And a really confident person who'd come from Pakistan and whatever initially. And it took about 20 minutes for this person to look either myself or Julie in the eye. They were that destroyed by it. And I think that's the thing that really sticks with me. And it's why it's important that the experience from Campsfield is used properly and effectively, because it changed government policy. And Helen's a person to talk about that more than me. So.
Yeah, can I just ask one quick question before we hear from Helen, because I know that she's got loads of medical experience. Is there any chance that there could be, like a married couple be sent in and separated?
Almost certainly. And the thing that's really worrying is women and their children.
Yeah, of course.
So it's in this country. So one of my most recent experiences is when I was still working as a GP in Gateshead, is we had families there who had been picked up twice over with young children who'd had a knock on the door at 4 a.m. These families sit there with bags packed with all of their details that they need to take with them by their front door. These are people living in your communities, often working in your churches. But if they don't have refugee status, they live in constant fear of being picked up at 4 a.m, separated as families, and being put into these prisons.
That's absolutely horrendous. Absolutely horrendous.
So Kat, just looking at the chat, Kat was just saying, Julie was talking about the consultation around immigration and women's health, that I think there's also a separate consultation going on around women's health generally. And I think, yes, it should still be possible to put a submission in specifically around the detention of women. As Julie alluded to, Women for Refugee Women have got a really good set of synopsis around the fact that something like 85 to 86% of women who seek asylum in this country have already been raped, tortured, subject to trafficking, or to female genital mutilation. And then if you look at the Medical Justice website, which is the group that I worked with when I was going into Campsfield, they have some really excellent reports around the effect of detention on the mental health of people who are detained. And there's a very good summary from the Royal College of Psychiatrists around why people who've been subject to torture and violence, as most of these women and very many of the men who seek asylum here are, why they should not be detained in these type of detention centres stroke prisons.
There is a lot of questions in the chat, but I'd like you to sort of touch on more of the mental health issues sort of arising from detention centres. Like, have you been to any of the detention centres? Or...
Okay. So I was a GP in Oxford. I've been in the North East a long time, and there are two bits to this I want to touch on. The bit about what places like Campsfield, which is the one I know best, and I probably visited and did reports for about 40 odd men when I worked down there, but also the effect of the Medhamsley Detention Centre, which is what Hassockfield used to have, on the surrounding area, and the young men who were detained there. So the first thing is that I was a GP in Oxford and doing a lot of work with refugees. Campsfield was a detention centre for men. And what we have to remember is that, and I saw 30 or 40 men there. At that stage, Campsfield was being run by G4S. But as a local GP working as a volunteer with groups like Medical Justice, I could visit people. So I was allowed to go in, I was allowed to see the men that were in there and examine them and do reports that would then go forward as part of their application for asylum and refugee status. I did not see one man in Campsfield who had had a criminal record. The men that I saw were men who had spoken out in their own country, so done things like I do on the monument on a regular basis when talking about the NHS, which is my other passion. I saw men who were gay, who'd been terrorised in their own country, because we have to remember that homosexuality is still a crime in many countries. I saw men who'd been involved in police service and in the army who had spoken out and then been locked up and tortured. Under our own laws, nobody who seeks asylum who has been tortured should be locked up. All of those men had been tortured in one way or another. Many had physical scars, but almost all of them had mental health issues. It is very clear that when you lock people up, and it was interesting, the question earlier about going to the cinema, and I was just thinking that corollary probably with the Young Offenders Institutes things, there is none of that went on 10 years ago, and the regime is much, much stricter. As Julie described, these were prisons. I had to go in, I was searched, my medical bags were searched, I would be taken into the medical centre. There would be a particular room that I was able to use and interview people, and then I would be escorted out. These men did not leave that detention centre once they entered until they were given bail or very occasionally leave to remain, or they were forcibly removed. And that's a whole other issue around what's going on about people being forcibly removed, which Julie touched on. And I think you're right around local airports being used. Mental health, aspects of immigration is very well established, and it consistently finds that a very negative impact on the detention, on mental health of detainees. The longer people are in detention, the worse their mental health gets. It's an independent factor for post-traumatic stress disorder. So many people who are seeking asylum and refugee status here already have PTSD because of what they've been through. Putting them into our immigration detention centre is an extra factor on top of that. And even after release, that extra effect will persist over 3 years. And of course, putting people in detention and often in solitary confinement is often a huge reminder of their own experience of torture. So whether that's waterboarding, whether it's electrical torture, whether it's a common one in Africa is falaka, where people get beaten on the soles of their feet because that's very difficult scars to actually pick up. All of those things are that people are re-traumatized by being locked up in our detention centre. There's a lot less literature around women because we haven't locked up as many women, and also far fewer women actually come and seek asylum and refugee status, because as Julie said, it's a huge, huge decision to leave the place that you live in order to travel to another country, a massive decision for people. Women make that decision less often. Obviously, we know about people being trafficked, and we are seeing these traumatized women now being locked up. So a massive issue. The other thing I'd like to just touch on is the whole issue around Medhamsley, because that was what Hassockfield was. That has a horrendous history. And for me, I've looked after men. So I came back from Oxford because I got homesick for the Northeast, although I'm not born here, I've been here 40 years. And I've looked after some of the young men who are now middle-aged, who were at Meadowell, who were abused, who were raped by the warders in Medhamsley. And that is a terrible, terrible legacy, not just for those men, but for that whole area as a whole. And I think there was something that was incredibly hopeful about changing that site into something that's positive. I think people like Richard Holden really do not understand how traumatizing it is for that community to go through that again. And in particular, for those men who went through Medhamsley, many of whom still suffer from really severe post-traumatic stress disorder that are still in many of our mental health, much of our mental health system now. I'll stop there. I could go on for a lot longer.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? I think that the whole thing's absolutely terrible. We've had a lot of questions, but I wanted to ask you something, and I'll go back to the chat in a second. So with Richard Holden and the Tories, and and the way that they're putting this media spin on it, do you think that it's causing for members of the public to sort of become detached to things like detention centres and immigration laws and things like that, because people don't want to get involved? So if people do want to get involved and they want to sort of help, what can people do to help you?
You want to answer that, Julie?
Unmute. Just talk about some of the amazing groups that we're working with, okay? We're working with a lot of different faith groups, interfaith groups, multi-faith groups. And there was a vigil a couple of weekends ago with a program, a service with clerics from different faith organizations, all kind of writing a kind of statement about why this shouldn't happen. And we do know, we have a lot of different churches around the area, and I think particularly during times of austerity and the pandemic, these churches have been very, very active in their communities in terms of things like food banks and giving counselling and social, trying to befriend people. So it was incredibly heartening to see this interfaith vigil take place and to read the words that people were that these faith leaders were effectively saying to their faith communities. And I think that is a good way for people. I'm not a person of faith. I don't need to have a faith leader tell me that this is wrong. But I do think that here in the northeast of England, we are not very used to detention centres. They've been very far away. We know about prisons. We've got a lot of prisons here, but we don't know very much about detention centres. And even refugee families that have been coming haven't been coming in large numbers. And the local authority officers that have been tasked with integrating those people have been doing it in a very kind of slow, step-by-step way. So I think that there needs to be some community projects, really. In fact, City of Sanctuary could be one of them. So one of our core members, Suzanne Fletcher, and I know she's watching tonight, she's very active in Tees Valley City Sanctuary. I worked for the national network City of Sanctuary on a COVID emergency response project. And there's a Durham City of Sanctuary, but City of Sanctuary also asks, for example, churches to be churches of sanctuary. Or I used to work in the arts, so you could be a theatre company of sanctuary, for example. You can be a school of sanctuary. They're just setting up gardens of sanctuary, businesses of sanctuary, shops of sanctuary. And it's a great movement because it's about, the theory of change is about contact and is about learning. And I think that's what we haven't had here in the northeast of England. We've been, particularly in Durham, we've been very far away from all of these problems. And so it's been easy for people like Richard Holden and the right-wing newspapers to tell lies to people who haven't had that kind of personal contact. So if people are interested, they should look at the City of Sanctuary website, they should start thinking about the community groups that they're involved with, and they should see how they can begin to establish these places of sanctuary. And because when our government decided that it wasn't going to do its fair shouldering the responsibility of refugees that were fleeing violence and persecution and unsustainable lives, civil society grassroots movements like City of Sanctuary went, okay, the government says it's not going to give sanctuary, but we're going to make our city, our town, even our local authority, a place of sanctuary ready for when people do come. And I think one of the things that we could do, which would be quite challenging for the current administration at Durham County Council, is to suggest that the local authority becomes a local authority of sanctuary. Okay, and I know several that have already done that. And that would be very testing, actually, wouldn't it, for some of the people now who've got themselves elected to be public representatives because of the pressures there from the church and from the schools and the teachers and the students and businesses, you know, and a whole range of different people from different walks of life. Actually, what would they turn around and say? We're not going to be a local authority of sanctuary. We don't want to do that. I think it's a very compelling offer, actually. And if we could get more involved in that, then I think we could win the argument, actually, which is what we need to do. You know, we need to win the argument so that when Richard Holden posts his horrible stuff on his Facebook page, there's a lot of people who are telling him that he's lying. And there's a lot of people saying, actually, you don't speak for me and for us and for our children.
It's a great idea. I'll take it to county. I think it's a great idea, and we've been looking at ways to like engage, like in our area, we've been looking at ways to engage like the age of kids where there doesn't seem to be anything for them, you know, like sort of 13 to 16-year-old types. And we've been thinking about, me and John's been thinking about like, could we maybe have a garden, like a community garden or anything like that? But I think if we did something like a garden of sanctuary, or try and did like a community of sanctuary, I think that would tie in really well. I'll definitely press it. Like, I think it's a great idea. I'll speak to you more about it, Julie. It's really good.
There's also Refugee Week coming up as well. And again, that's a great moment to remember all the incredible refugees who've made our country what it is, who are patriotic British people who were welcomed here, you know, and have been inventors and business people and leaders and innovators and, you know, good people who've contributed. So look for Refugee Week as well, and the amazing events that will be coming up. And actually, if people just start to understand about that, what I was talking about earlier about patterns of migration, and, you know, and understand how this is normal human behavior. You know, it's in your instinct to take care of yourself and your vulnerable family members, isn't it? That's a natural instinct. We would all do that.
Yeah, I do think that sometimes people need to take a second, almost like a second look on it. Like, it isn't just about you, it's about everybody. And as someone in the chat earlier put, you know, any one of us could find ourselves in that situation, and can you imagine being torn apart from your family? Like, I do think that we need to think about that in a sense of look after everybody and treat someone how you want to be treated. Sorry, Owain, I cut you off there.
Yeah, can I jump in just very quickly? There's loads of different things that cropped up in my mind, but one thing that has been quite interesting, and obviously we've been talking about Richard Holden as the MP and that kind of stuff, because that's unfortunately what he is, but his language has changed very subtly recently. And it's moved away from pushing the jobs line, pushing the money, pushing that kind of stuff to, oh, it's all opposition activists. So he's lumping all these people who are against detention for asylum seekers and immigrants into this one category. And at the same time that appeared, we had Renee Kassan, which is UK's Jewish human rights charity, come forward and say, look, we want to help you. And I mean, not to kind of go into the ins and outs of the different traditions within the Jewish faith, but within half an hour of them getting in touch, they'd managed to link together the ultra-Orthodox community in Gateshead with the Liberal and Reform community and Rabbi Sybil in Jesmond, which I think from what Rachel Vogler, who's their organiser, said was a first. These people have come together because of what the government are doing. And so lumping all of us together as opposition activists or the usual people is really helpful. So we can go and be in the community, that kind of thing. But there's a couple of things that Helen mentioned about the community at Bedhamsley. That one person who has requested to remain anonymous got in touch very, very early on, I think it must have been middle of February, and said the moment that he heard that the site was going to be reused for detention, his nightmare started again. And so he had to go into his own community. I mean, he lives in Glasgow now, of all places. But he had to go into his community to find safety, and people welcomed him in because he was frightened more than anything else, because people might experience the same kind of thing. And I think because that's what's being promised, there's lots we can do together as individuals, as groups, or as people who are connected more, even globally, and very simple things, so whether that's with people of faith or not. But it is quite interesting that he's pushing this sort of opposition activist line. And the one thing he hasn't mentioned, and we've actually not mentioned so far, is that County Durham, I mean, bear in mind it's 1,100 square miles, give or take, the actual size of it, by geographical area. It has the lowest number of suitably qualified legal representatives in the country. And when you get picked up from the streets, you have 14 days to apply for bail, have that JR go in, and then have that done granted in your favour. So if, for example, you're picked up in, let's say Belfast and then put into Larne House, you have 14 days from the moment you enter into the system. So basically, as soon as you get in the car, to put that in. But if you are then moved between Larne House to Glasgow or Manchester short-term holding centres, that could take as much as 4 days, so that they've got 4 days of psychological trauma, working out whether or not they'll be moved or whatever. And then you will then move from Glasgow or Manchester to Hassockfield. That's basically nearly 2/3 of the time gone by the time you get to Hassockfield for them to apply for this. So you're basically removed without any legal redress. And the thing that really disturbed me beyond the case that we had was that they would use that threat of a flight out of the UK to keep people as a supplicant to the system, not as somebody who has been physically or mentally damaged in the process of arriving in the UK, whether that be through torture or whatever. And this constituent said, look, he phoned his wife. In the 1 hour he had a day of free time outside of his cell, because it's not a room, it's a cell. They're locked in. And he said, look, they've given me this ticket, 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, from Heathrow in this instance. I mean, he'd been moved to Gatwick at one point as well. And they'd given it to him in Morton Hall. So he just went quiet. He didn't speak to anybody. And then they can then be removed from the detention centre, in inverted commas, at any time of day or night. So it could be 4 a.m. or it could be 6 p.m. And they're left in the truck basically until they get to where they're going to. So it's not just the physical impact of being detained, but that mental threat of being removed from the UK, whether or not you've done something that you shouldn't have done, or like overstay a visa, or just because you are within the hostile environment here incorrectly, based on the government's own terms. There's lots of different things that people don't see. So that removal, like I say, can be done at any time of day, and it's not done in a sort of camper van type thing. It's a prison van, and again, they're basically checked out of where they're held, put into this van and locked in until they're unlocked and put into this place, for example, at Heathrow, where you go from solitary confinement into a shared, potentially mixed sex cell prior to being removed. And the constituent said, look, I had no privacy. We had to share a toilet. We shared a shower. And I couldn't phone my partner to say this is what's going on until this person had gone to the shower block, whatever it was. And again, there was no time to himself. And it just that the impact of not just a removal threat, but also being put into a cell with somebody you don't know, who could be a trafficker, who could be physically, verbally, or psychologically abusive to you in a 24-hour period just before you go into the plane. And that happened 3 times to this person. And it happens innumerable times across the UK. And I think there's something else. Oh, one thing on the community aspect, that if it does open and there is no visitation rights and befriending is not allowed and that kind of thing, one thing that Fiona was really good at suggesting and encouraging people to do is go into the OIS training. So I think there's 3 levels where you go in initially and you can advise people in a safe space what their rights and that kind of stuff. And then level 3 is your own advice and you can help them, that kind of stuff. So because we have so few people who are properly qualified to advise, that OIS training could be really helpful as a community thing, and bringing in people who have experience of the system, whether that be workers from Hassockfield Secure Training Centre who want to do something, or us as members of the public who want to get involved and do anything. And I think with the faith groups coming on side and working with us, it's been amazing because it's brought all of these different people who wouldn't necessarily want to be involved, not just to help with the campaign, but they start talking. And when they start talking, that's when Richard Holden can't cope. Because there's one comment that I noticed about getting Bishop Paul, the Bishop of Durham, involved, and we requested via the Bishop's office that Richard Holden come to a public meeting chaired by the Bishop of Durham, and it was meant to be beginning of May, and Richard Holden refused, and I think I know why, and it's probably because his constituents would be there and they would ask awkward questions, and it's because we've been talking that we can ask awkward questions, and we shouldn't be afraid of that. So that's the end of my bit, but yeah, anything and everything, just do it.
Yeah, go on, Helen, jump in.
I was going to say, it was interesting at Campsfield because Oxford has a lot of healthy, retired, middle-aged white people. It has the best community sector I have ever met. That Oxfam is Oxford Against Famine. So around Campsfield, there were lots of different voluntary sector groups. And so somebody arrived in Campsfield, we're talking 10 years ago, where there would be at least 3 different groups that would be notified, that would then get support into that person, would try and get them legal representation. It was recognised within Campsfield, and the staff were aware that they needed to ensure that people had been notified. All of that is under current Tory legislation has now gone. As Owain and Julie have said, no visitation rights means that somebody like me as a volunteer doctor would not be able to go in to see somebody. Somebody from Bell for Immigration Detainees would not be able to go in and see people. And I think, as Owain has just said, there is very good reasons why they're very interested in Meddomsley in terms of its geographic isolation, but completely being within a community that is just doesn't have that kind of voluntary sector set up at all around that prison. So I think we need to fight to try and stop it from opening. But I do think there is something about beginning to skill people up so that if it does open, that we can put real pressure on. So I think that's what we should be doing. My big worry is, and somebody had asked about the Tory MPs, and the problem is that with a Tory government with a huge majority, that's going to be very difficult. There were 6 Tories that voted in the last Parliament. The Lords had amended the bill around unaccompanied child refugees, and only 6 Tories voted against it. David Davis, David Amess, Tim Lawton and Remy Chisty were 4 that I can see. But the problem is, with such a huge majority, my big fear, and I'm sure many others, is this will open. So we really need to continue to fight, continue to do all the things we've just talked about, but also begin to think about how we gear ourselves up to really start to try and provide protest about this place opening, but also the groups that will be needed to try and support people who'll be there.
That's great, thank you. The other thing what I found earlier on, because I was just going on your website again, so I'm going to drop the website into the chat. And I love the section that you've got, you know, what can you do to help? And then you've listed Richard Holden's contact details. So if any of our viewers or members want to contact Richard Holden and tell him what you think about the No to Hassockfield campaign and whether you agree with it or not, I'll drop the website in now, just so you all can engage with them and tell them what a wonderful idea it isn't. I'm trying to think, I'm just trying to quickly have a look and see if anyone else has asked any more questions. Mary says, in my opinion, Richard Holden is doing this for his personal agenda to make him look good to his followers.
It's dog whistle racism is what it is. Really. It's dog whistle racism. This is how populism works, and it plays on people's fears, and people are afraid. People are afraid for their, you know, we're dealing with multiple crises. It's a you know, an awful historic moment for the world, and people are rightly very scared. But opening a detention centre for vulnerable women won't fix the problems that people are actually facing on the ground, you know, about education, about the health service, about, you know, about local facilities that they really, really need. And when Richard Holden talks about decent jobs, he's also lying, because these will not be decent jobs at all. Right, they won't be decent jobs. They'll be. We've already said that the contracts will be given to the Tories' mates, you know, in return for donations, and we can expect to see a whole load of firms and contractors in there that don't uphold workers' rights, for example. Yeah. You know, we should be fighting this on lots of different levels.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you very much.
We should continue to dig to find out how much money Richard Holden and his family and his mates are making from it. Because I think if we dig deep enough, that is the culture at the moment, and he will be making money from it somewhere.
Yeah, definitely. Anthony's just commented and said, aren't detention centres another name for concentration camps?
They are, and I think it's horrific that we are accepting that this is an okay thing to happen in our country. This is not Nazi Germany. This is not Thailand. This is not South America. This is County Durham. We should be horrified, and we need to get that message across to all of our friends, our neighbours. This is 0.29% of the UK population is an asylum seeker or a refugee. We do not have small numbers in this country, but we are now have a population believes it's a massive problem. It is not. And as Julia said, throughout our history, refugees and immigrants have brought so much, have delivered so much, that really is what we need to be building on. Sorry.
No, that's great. Thank you very much. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read out your website, and then we'll take any last comments and questions, and then we'll say goodnight. So, Julie, is there anything that you'd like to finish up on?
I would say get yourself, learn about this issue, read and learn as much as you can. I went into politics never having been a politician, but it didn't mean that I couldn't find out about things. You know, we've got a world of online information, and it's not difficult to find out about. I'm interested in human rights norms, and I did a lot of work on human rights when I was an MEP, and I'm so proud of the work that my office did and the work that Owain did when we took on cases to stop people being deported. But I'm a theatre maker, I'm a poet, but I care about people and about human rights and about vulnerable people. And I just made it my business to find out about, what are the norms. There's also the UN, so the United Nations also has a convention on refugees. And the current Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, who used to be the Prime Minister of Portugal, actually, and he's a fantastic Secretary General, and he is working in very difficult circumstances, when we've got countries like the UK that's not really playing ball, wants to do a lot of things unilaterally as opposed to multilaterally. But it's not difficult to find out about the different charters and conventions that we have signed up to and the different organizations that we are party to, which is why I talked about the Council of Europe. And once you start to look and you see where we are as a country, moving further and further and further away from that position as a country that stands up for human rights, I think it's very, very concerning. So this is a time I've discovered over the past year in lockdown, it's been a time of education for me. I've had, it's difficult to do things, to meet people, to go out, but actually there's any number of really interesting online events and different online campaigns, and what you're doing here today with the Socialist Think Tank, where we can learn and skill ourselves up and be ready for the fight that's coming. Because as Helen pointed out, sadly, the Tories have a huge majority, and they're rewriting the new plan for immigration so that Priti Patel can do what the hell she likes, and she won't be breaking the law because she'll have made new laws which put people at even more risk. So this isn't, I think for me, we're fighting Hassockfield, but we also have a bigger fight on our hands, and that is about the Tories' ongoing hostile environment that they have created against anybody who is other.
Totally agree. I totally agree. I think it's everyone's business, isn't it? I mean, I would definitely hold my hands up and say I'm not the most educated on detainment centres or immigration centres or anything like that. But the minute you start reading about it and the minute you start actually talking to people about it, it's horrendous. And it is about not listening to the media and just going and speaking to people. Owain, is there anything that you'd like to end on?
Just a couple of things. The barrister that we used, in inverted commas, in 2019 is on Twitter. And if you ever need any, or if you've got any questions, or you want to know what the process is for judicial reviews in terms of what goes on, Jane Haybrook lives down in London. I think she's in Jeremy Corbyn's constituency. She's amazing. She'll answer any questions you've got, whether they be whether you think they're silly or too complicated, and she'll come back with with loads of different things. So follow her. She's Zero Calamity on Twitter, or Cremon Communard with the hashtag activist lawyer, which is great. And also, I think finally, one of our biggest supporters from the start has been Alf Dubs. And I'll finish on this because the one thing that he said that is really important, and as Julie just said about the different treaties that we're signing up to, is that no one is illegal. And we can't forget that. No one is illegal.
Yep, great. Helen?
And I would just say that I think, despite the majority, I think Hassockfield is something that we could stop. I think there are so many things here, and this is a potential fight that if enough people get involved, if enough people question Richard Holden and what is going on and give it publicity, I think it is something we could stop. And a time when it feels like there's so much from the left, it feels like we can't change at the minute. This is a very active campaign that it is absolutely worth getting involved in. And one of the things that keeps me going is one of my overriding memories at Campsfield with medical justices had worked with a couple of guys that we managed to get bail for. And I went from seeing them in a cell in Campsfield to the following week, them being in Parliament with us, actually speaking to Alf Dubs and a whole group of other MPs and talking about their story, and going from being prisoners to being proud men who had been tortured in their own country because they'd spoken out against the policies. And there they were in our House of Commons. It was such an amazing moment. And then we went to the pub afterwards and they just loved every minute of it. And for me, that was the whole humanity around, as Owain has just said, nobody's illegal. These are people, and almost all, certainly all the ones I've ever met, of people who can't asylum and refugee status, leave their own countries because there is something terribly, terribly wrong in what is happening there. So it's believing the humanity, but also I do think that stopping us from having this detention centre is something that's winnable. So please do educate yourselves, but have a good look at those things you can do. Please question Richard Holden.
Yeah, definitely. I've dropped it in, and I've just seen that Laura's dropped his email address in as well, so you know it's available. I don't know if you're aware, just to end on something. So there's a couple of people in the chat talking about I'm a Lib Dem. Thank you for letting me listen in. I haven't disagreed with anything that the panelists have said. And, you know, she wants to say that she's glad that this is a cross-party campaign for everybody in all parties to be involved in, you know, regardless of their political background. And then someone else has commented and said, you know, well, when it comes to treating people as we would wish to be treated, party politics doesn't really come into it, and we should, you know, treat humans humanly. And there's something that I would just like to end on. So, you know, the Durham County Council Coalition of Chaos, if any of the joint administration would like to stand independently and say, no, this is not a good idea, and, you know, we do need to stop this, then, you know, we should all be doing that together. We should not be sat in bed with the Tories making plans. We should be out there and we should be stopping it. I just wanted to bring it up because it was like teetering around in the chat. And I just think, you know, if we're gonna talk about it, we might as well talk about it properly. So, but I will definitely be in touch, Julie, about some sort of city of sanctuary idea. I love it. It's really good. So I'd just like to say thank you very much for you all for coming on. If you want to go to the No Hassockfield website, I've dropped it in the chat a couple of times, and also feel free to email Richard Holden. Don't forget, so if you're on YouTube, you can subscribe. If you're on Facebook, you can like and share. We're available on Twitter as well. You can also become a member for free if you visit our website, www.socialisthinktank.com, and we'll say goodnight to the members and the viewers, but if everyone could just stay on the line, then we'll say goodnight as well. Okay, so thank you very much for everybody for watching, and we'll see you soon.
We'll keep the red flag flying here.